The next concept we need to talk about is radiation measurement. It's important for the dental assistant to understand radiation measurement just in case they need to explain to the patient exposure and dosage concepts. We've already mentioned that some patients have a concern with being exposed to radiation in the dental office, and if you understand the measurements of it, you should be able to help the patient understand that radiation is safe within the dental office. So, how do we measure radiation? Well, it can be measured in the same way that other physical concepts are measured. So, we have time. Time is measured in seconds, minutes, hours, so on and so forth. Distance, miles, kilometers. Radiation is going to be defined with three quantities of radiation. So, we have the exposure, the dose, and something called the dose equivalent. And currently, there's two systems that are used to define radiation measurements. So let's dive in to those two systems now. The first is the traditional system, also known as the standard system. And the units of measurement for the traditional system are the Rankine, the radiation absorbed dose, the Rankine equivalent in man. And then we have the SI system, or the System International de Units. Forgive my accent. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But the radiation measurements we use for that system, for the SI system, are coulombs per kilogram, the gray, and the sievert. So the first quantity was exposure. So let's discuss the exposure measurements. This is the measurement of ionization in the air produced by X-rays. Remember that ionization is the process of an atom gaining or losing an electron. So this is that process that's occurring in the air when X-rays are produced. And this is measured in the traditional system or the standard system by the Rankine. And what it is specifically measuring is the amount of energy that reaches the surface of an organism, but it does not show how much was absorbed. So basically, what this is saying is that when you're measuring with a Rankine, there's a known volume of air. So remember, it's measuring the ionization in the air. So we have a known volume of air that is exposed to radiation, and we know that it reaches the surface of the organism, but we don't know how much of that was actually absorbed into the tissue. So essentially, the Rankine or measuring with a Rankine is limited because we need to know that volume of air. There is no SI equivalent to the Rankine. So the Rankine kind of stands alone in the way that it measures radiation. So with the SI system, what is used? This is where the coulomb per kilogram comes in. So first we need to understand that a coulomb is a unit of electrical charge. So a coulomb per kilogram is going to measure the number of electrical charges in 1 kilogram of air. Remember though, these two things are not equal. They are measuring different amounts. They are, in a sense, measuring different things. So the second quantity that's measured is the dose. Restarting that slide. So the second quantity is the dose. And dose is basically the amount of energy that is absorbed by the tissue. This can also be known as the radiation absorbed dose. This is the traditional systems unit of dose. And like previously mentioned here, it is going to measure the radiation absorbed by the tissue. Its abbreviation is RAD. Sometimes it's referred to as the RAD. And it is not restricted to air. And it does have an equivalent. So the SI equivalent of the RAD, or the radiation absorbed dose, is the gray. And when you break it down to figure out how they equal each other, 1 rad equals 0.01 grays. GY is the abbreviation for gray. And 1 gray equals 100 rads. And the third quantity is the dose equivalent measurement. Previously, we had talked about dose and the effects that it can have. And different types of radiation are going to have different effects on the tissue. So the dose equivalent measurement is used to compare the biological effects of different types of radiation. And there are equivalents for both systems here. The traditional unit is called the Rankine equivalent in man, or the REM. This is the absorbed dose and a quality factor. So it is the RAD, radiation absorbed dose, and a quality factor that is very specific for the type of radiation that is being used. A quality factor, also known as a QF, is just a dimensionless multiplier. The QF of radiation is going to be based on the different type of biological damage that can be done. And for X-rays, the QF is going to be 1. So traditional unit is the Rankine equivalent in man, and it's the absorbed dose plus a quality factor, and a quality factor. So that quality factor is always going to be 1 when we're speaking of dental X-rays. The SI equivalent to the REM is the sievert, or SV. And to convert them, we have 1 REM equals 0.01 sievert, or 1 sievert equals 100 REM. There are always risks involved in radiation, and to understand those risks, we need to understand any potential source for radiation exposure. And there are several different sources of exposure that we come into contact with daily. And these sources can be classified into 2 separate groups, and they are either natural sources or background sources. Basically, they're all background sources, but they can either be natural or not natural. So, what that means is that these are ongoing things that we're exposed to every day, basically without being aware of it. And the first one I want to talk about is cosmic exposure. This comes from outer space and the sun. Where you are at basically determines how much of that radiation you are going to receive. Those places that live in a higher altitude are going to have more naturally occurring cosmic exposure than those that live at lower altitudes. The next form is terrestrial exposure, and this is from the ground or from the earth. This is radiation that comes from elements that are naturally found in the earth. Different forms of potassium and uranium would be examples of this. And like your cosmic exposures, where you live, both of these, the exposure is going to vary depending on where you live. And we also have artificial sources of radiation. These are your man-made consumer products, your TVs, your watches, your computers, your cell phones. These all have forms of radiation. And then there's medical radiation, which is probably one of the more popular or more well-known versions of artificial radiation. And this is about half of the total exposure to radiation that people may receive. And this category includes any kind of medical radiographic procedures, any kind of dental images, any kind of radiation therapy that you may receive. This is all artificial medical radiation that contributes to your natural daily exposure to radiation. And most people don't think about the TVs, the watches, computers, cell phones. They don't think of them as being radiation exposure. So we just sit here all day, every day, playing on our phones, our computers, our watches, our iPads, whatever device you have, and we are just constantly exposed to some form of radiation. So, with all of that, what's the risk in dental imaging? Is there a risk in dental imaging? There has been research done to show that the potential risk of having x rays taken in the dental office, the risk of it inducing a fatal cancer, has been estimated at approximately 3 in 1 million. So, 3 people out of 1 million people could potentially have a development of a fatal cancer because of dental radiography. So, to help sort of put things into perspective, research has been done to show also that the likelihood of producing cancer is 3 in 1 million for dental radiology. So you are more likely to have a fatality, not from dental images, but you are more likely to have a fatality from the following things: riding 10 miles on a bike, being in a car for 300 miles, being in a plane for 1,000 miles, smoking just 1.4 cigarettes per day. 1.4 cigarettes per day has a higher chance of causing death than having dental x-rays taken. So what's the risk? What elements are at risk with dental radiology? We need to take a look at the critical organs again. What dosage of radiation reaches critical organs? And a reminder that a critical organ is an organ that, if damaged, will diminish the quality of life for that person. And the first one we're going to look at is the thyroid gland. It's usually hit by scatter radiation. Your thyroid is not typically hit with the primary radiation beam. It's the scatter radiation that's of danger. And part of the danger with that is that we don't know what direction it goes. We don't know where it bounces off and what direction it scatters to. But it does need large doses. So again, you would need lots and lots and lots of dental x-rays taken in a short period of time for there to be any serious damage done. Bone marrow. That is the next one. The maxilla and the mandible have very little bone marrow. So even though bone marrow is a critical organ, it's not at high risk when we're speaking with dental radiology. And then there's the skin. You would need more than 500 films in 14 days to be exposed in order to produce reddening of the skin. So in 2 weeks, that's 14 days, 2 weeks, you would need 500 films for there even to be a little bit of a rash on your skin. The likelihood of that happening is extremely, extremely slim. And last is the eyes, and you would need more than 200,000 MRADs necessary to cause cataracts. And an MRAD is a unit that is smaller than a rad. It's a millirad, so it's an MRAD. So you would need 200,000 MRADs necessary to cause cataracts. That high of a dose is not likely to happen in the dental radiography. That high of a dose is not likely to happen in the dental office. If you are using a fast film and a long PID or a long cone and taking a full mouth series, they say it's about 60 MRADs that you would be exposed to or that your eyes would be exposed to in the dental office. So scientists are no longer considering the eyes a critical organ in dental radiology, but it's something that we still need to be aware of and something that we still needed to discuss. Now that we know all of these things about radiation biology, we need to discuss the patient exposure and dose. Patients must always be protected from excess exposure. And how much radiation, uh, let's go back. I want to start that slide again. So our dental patients must always be protected from excess exposure to radiation. Now that we know the effects of radiation biology and how it affects our biology. Take 3. Let's try this one more time. We must always protect our patients from being exposed to excess radiation, especially now that you know the effects that it can cause if there is an overexposure. So the amount of exposure is going to vary depending on a couple of things. First is your receptor choice. The amount of radiation is reduced when you're using digital. It uses a significantly less amount of radiation to expose a digital film than it does a traditional film. But if you are using traditional film, using a fast film, use the fastest speed that's available. F-speed is currently the fastest. So if you're using that, you are decreasing the amount of exposure. The next factor is collimation. If you use a rectangular collimator instead of a round, that rectangular collimator is basically going to be the size of the film. And when it's placed up against the patient's cheek and aligned correctly, all of that radiation should basically hit only the tissue that is in that rectangular shape and go directly to the film. The operator's technique. If you increase the target to receptor distance. So remember, the target we're talking about is the tungsten target. The receptor is the film or the digital sensor. If you increase that distance, those waves or those X-rays lose penetrating power, lose energy as they travel through that cone or through the PID. So if you increase your target receptor distance, you're going to decrease the amount of radiation. And by using the paralleling technique, you may reduce the number of retakes that need to be taken because you will line it up perfectly. Theory, hopefully, you will line it up perfectly with that ring and line it up perfectly with that film, and there won't need to be any retakes. And another way here that's not on this list is to always outweigh the risk versus benefit. Is this an x-ray we really need? Did the doctor prescribe it? If you cannot answer yes to both of those, then reduce the risk, reduce the exposure, and do not take the film. That is the end of radiation biology. So let's do our review. The latent period in radiation biology is the time between A, exposure of film and development, B, subsequent doses of radiation, C, exposure to radiation and clinical symptoms, or D, pressing the exposure button and the film being ready to view. The correct answer is C, exposure to radiation and clinical symptoms. Radiation injuries that are not seen in the person irradiated, but that occur in future generations are known as A, somatic effects, B, genetic effects, C, cumulative effects, or D, latent effects? The correct answer is B, genetic effects. Which of the following is considered radioresistant? A, immature reproductive cells, B, young bone cells, C, mature bone cells, or D, epithelial cells? Correct answer is B, mature bone cells. Radioresistant, meaning they can resist radiation. And the last one, the unit for measuring the absorption of X-rays is termed A, the Rankine, B, the rad, C, the rem, or D, the sievert? Correct answer is B, the rad, or radiation absorbed dose.